August 25, 1942, Milne Bay, New Guinea. Corporal John French of the Australian 2nd and 14th Infantry Battalion pressed his shoulder against the stock of his boy's anti-tank rifle, tracking the silhouette of a Japanese Type 95 Hargo light tank as it manoeuvred through the kunai grass ahead. The tank's diesel engine coughed and sputtered in the tropical humidity, its commander visible through the open hatch, scanning for targets. French steadied his breathing, aligned his sights on the tank's hull armor, and squeezed the trigger. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The .525 caliber armor-piercing round struck the Type 95 side plating with a metallic crack that echoed through the jungle. The tank lurched, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Within seconds, the crew began evacuating. French had just demonstrated something that would fundamentally alter Allied infantry tactics in the Pacific theatre. The Japanese tank that intelligence officers had warned about, the armoured threat that was supposed to dominate island warfare, had been defeated by a single rifle round fired by one infantryman. This moment at Milne Bay marked the beginning of a profound realization that would spread through Marine and Army units across the Pacific. The Type 95 Hargo, Japan's most numerous tank, the armoured vehicle that had terrorized Chinese forces and swept through Malaya and the Philippines, possessed armour so thin that standard infantry weapons could penetrate it. Not specialized anti-tank guns, not artillery, ordinary rifle fire. The psychological impact of this discovery would prove as significant as the tactical advantage it provided. American Marines, preparing for brutal island assaults against an enemy known for fanatical resistance, learned they didn't need to fear Japanese armor. They needed only to aim carefully. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Type 95 Hargo light tank entered Japanese service in 1935, designed to address a specific military requirement. The Imperial Japanese Army needed a tank that could keep pace with motorized infantry traveling at 40 kilometers per hour, something the older Type 89 medium tank could not achieve. The result was a lightweight, mobile platform that embodied Japanese armored doctrine of the 1930s. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries produced the initial prototypes, with production beginning in 1936. The design philosophy prioritized mobility and mechanical reliability over armor protection. At 7.4 tons, the Hargo was half the weight of the Type 89, yet used the same Mitsubishi air-cooled diesel engine generating 120 horsepower. This gave the tank impressive speed, reaching 45 kilometers per hour on roads and maintaining mobility across difficult terrain. The armament consisted of a Type 94 37mm tank gun, mounted in a one-man turret, complemented by two Type 97 7.7mm machine guns, one rear-facing in the turret and one hull-mounted. The 37mm gun could fire both high-explosive and armor-piercing ammunition. At optimal range, the armor-piercing round achieved a muzzle velocity of 580 meters per second, and could penetrate 36 millimeters of armor at a distance of 275 meters. For operations against Chinese forces in the Second Sino-Japanese War, these specifications proved adequate. Chinese armies lacked significant armor, and the Hargo's combination of mobility and firepower allowed Japanese mechanized units to exploit breakthroughs and support infantry advances effectively. Between 1937 and 1941, Type 95 tanks participated in numerous engagements across China, establishing a reputation as reliable and effective combat vehicles. But the armor specifications told a different story. Maximum armor thickness measured 12 millimeters on the hull and turret front, sides, and rear. The top and bottom plates measured only 9 millimeters. These specifications had been determined during peacetime design reviews in 1935, when Japanese engineers calculated that 12 millimeters would provide adequate protection against 7.7mm armor-piercing rifle rounds at combat ranges. This calculation contained a fatal flaw. It assumed that enemy infantry would engage tanks at distances exceeding several hundred meters, where bullet velocity and penetration capability decreased significantly. It did not account for close-range combat in jungle terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 100 meters. It did not consider that desperate infantrymen might fire at tanks from point-blank range. And it certainly did not anticipate that American forces would field rifles firing the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge, with armor-piercing variants specifically designed to penetrate light armor. The three-man crew operated in cramped conditions that reflected Japanese design priorities. The commander sat in the turret, standing on the hull floor with no seat provided, simultaneously operating the 37mm gun, commanding the vehicle, and manning the rear-facing machine gun. The driver occupied the front left position, while the hull machine gunner sat to the driver's right. This arrangement meant the commander performed the duties that Western tanks divided among 2 or 3 crewmen. Communication between vehicles relied on flag signals and hand gestures. Only one tank in each 4-tank platoon carried a radio, meaning that if that vehicle was destroyed, the platoon lost all coordination capability. This limitation would prove devastating in combat against American forces equipped with extensive radio networks that allowed instant communication between infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support. Production accelerated as war with China intensified. By 1939, 100 units had been completed. Mitsubishi's factories eventually produced 853 tanks, with another 1,250 units built by Sagami Arsenal, Hitachi Industries, Niigata Tekosho, Kobe Seikosho, and Kokura Arsenal. Over 2,300 Type 95 tanks rolled off production lines before the war's end, making it Japan's most numerous armoured vehicle. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939 provided the first indication that the Hago faced serious vulnerabilities against modern opponents. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 light tanks, armed with 45mm guns achieving muzzle, velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second, could penetrate Type 95 armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Japanese 37mm guns had maximum effective ranges under 700 meters. Type 95 crews faced the terrifying reality of being destroyed by enemy tanks before they could return effective fire. Japanese tank officers who survived Khalkhin Gol reported the disparity to their superiors. The reports acknowledged that Soviet tanks outranged Japanese armor by substantial margins, but the reports also noted that Soviet BT tanks were highly vulnerable to close-quarter teams using Molotov cocktails due to their gasoline engines. Japanese commanders concluded that infantry anti-tank tactics and combined arms coordination could compensate for the Type 95's technical limitations. This conclusion would prove catastrophically wrong in the Pacific theater. December 8, 1941. The Imperial Japanese Army launched simultaneous invasions across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Type 95 tanks participated in the Philippine landings, where approximately 160 Japanese tanks, including numerous Hagos, supported infantry assaults against American and Filipino defenders. America's first tank versus tank battle of World War II occurred on December 22, 1941, north of Damortis during the retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. Type 95 light tanks from the 4th Tank Regiment engaged 5 new M3 Stuart light tanks from B Company, 192nd Tank Battalion. Both tank types mounted 37mm guns, but the M3 Stuart featured 32mm turret armor compared to the Type 95's 12mm protection. The engagement demonstrated that armor thickness and crew training determined outcomes more than gun caliber. The Japanese tanks reacted first, destroying the lead M3 as it attempted to leave the road. The 4 remaining American tanks all suffered hits as they retreated. Japanese crews had spotted their opponents first, fired first, and achieved hits first. But on December 31st, American M3 tanks operating from prepared defensive positions destroyed 8 Type 95s in a single engagement, demonstrating that when American crews held tactical advantage, Japanese armor was extremely vulnerable. The Philippines campaign revealed another critical weakness. Japanese tank units lacked the logistical infrastructure to sustain armoured operations at the tempo required for decisive victory. Fuel supplies, spare parts, and ammunition distribution systems that functioned adequately in China collapsed under the demands of rapid mechanized warfare against a well-equipped opponent. Type 95 tanks frequently sat immobilized awaiting fuel or parts while American defenders reinforced their positions. Malaya demonstrated the Type 95 at its most effective. British commanders had concluded that tanks could not operate in thick jungle terrain and deployed almost no armour to defend the peninsula. 12 Type 95s participating in the attack that broke the Jitra line on December 11, 1941, achieved complete surprise. British infantry, equipped only with small arms and unprepared for armoured assault, broke and retreated. The presence of just 12 light tanks influenced the entire battle's outcome. August 7, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The 1st Marine Division's 1st Tank Battalion landed M2A4 and M3 Stuart light tanks on the beaches, becoming the first Marine tank units to see combat in the dense rainforests of the South Pacific Islands. The Marines anticipated encountering Japanese armour, but found the island's defenders had evacuated most heavy equipment before the landing. For months, Marine tankers trained and prepared for armoured combat that never materialised. The M2A4 light tank, built in 1940, was America's closest equivalent to the Type 95 in terms of armament and protection. It featured 25mm turret armour and mounted a 37mm main gun. The later M3 Stuart improved protection to 32mm on the turret sides. Both American designs significantly outweighed the 7.4-ton Hargo, with the Stuart weighing over 13 tons. But this additional mass translated directly into better crew protection. More significantly, Marine infantrymen carried weapons fundamentally different from those available to Chinese or British Commonwealth forces. The M1 Garand rifle, officially adopted as standard issue in November 1941, fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge. This round, designated cartridge ball caliber .30 M2, propelled a 152 grain bullet at a muzzle velocity of 2,805 feet per second, generating 2,656 foot-pounds of energy. The armor-piercing variant, designated cartridge caliber .30 armor-piercing M2, featured a hardened steel core designed specifically to penetrate light armor. Tests conducted by the Army Ballistics Research Laboratory demonstrated that M2 armor-piercing rounds could penetrate at least 10.6 millimeters of armor steel at 100 yards. Subsequent testing by brass fetchers showed penetration of 12.7 millimeters of MIL-A12 560 armor steel at 100 yards, with the round striking the plate at 2,601 feet per second. These specifications had profound implications for Japanese armor. The Type 95's maximum armor thickness of 12 millimeters meant that American armor-piercing .30-06 ammunition could penetrate every surface of the tank at combat ranges. The 9mm top and bottom plates offered even less protection. A Marine rifleman with standard-issue ammunition and could destroy a Japanese tank that doctrine classified as requiring specialized anti-tank weapons. But in August 1942, neither American intelligence nor frontline Marines understood this reality. The armor-piercing characteristics of .30-06 ammunition were known to ordnance specialists and ballistics experts. The armor specifications of Japanese tanks were documented in intelligence files. Nobody had yet connected these two pieces of information to realize that standard infantry rifles represented effective anti-tank weapons against Japanese armor. The revelation began at Milne Bay on August 25, 1942, when 2 Type 95 tanks landed to support Japanese Marines attacking Australian defensive positions. The tanks initially proved successful against lightly armed infantry, whose sticky bombs failed to adhere in the tropical humidity. But when Corporal John French engaged one tank with his Boy's anti-tank rifle, firing a .5-5 caliber armor-piercing round, the projectile punched completely through the Hargo's side armor, disabling the vehicle. The second, Type 95, bogged down in mud created by intense rainfall and was abandoned. Australian troops examined both tanks extensively. Officers measured the armour thickness, documented the internal layout, and tested various weapons against the hulls. They discovered that .303 rifle fire, the standard British round, similar in performance to American .30-06 ammunition, could penetrate the thinner armour sections, particularly around the engine compartment. The Australian War Memorial's Type 95, recovered from Milne Bay, still bears evidence of this testing. Large bullet holes measuring 0.5 to 5 inches from the boy's rifle penetrate the hull. Smaller .303 caliber holes from rifle fire mark the armour plates. The physical evidence documented what would soon become tactical doctrine across the Pacific. Japanese tanks were vulnerable to infantry small arms fire. But information travelled slowly in 1942. Australian reports from Milne Bay circulated through Commonwealth Command channels. American intelligence in Melbourne received summaries but not detailed technical analyses. Marine units preparing for offensive operations remained largely unaware that their standard rifles could defeat Japanese armour. November 20th, 1943. Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. The 2nd Marine Division launched the first major amphibious assault against heavily defended Japanese positions in the Central Pacific. Intelligence indicated that 7 Type 95 tanks from the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force defended Batio Island, dug into revetments and positioned to engage landing craft and infantry at the waterline. The Marine assault plan called for M4A2 Sherman medium tanks from the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps Tank Battalion to provide fire support. The 30-ton Shermans, with 76mm of frontal armour and 75mm main guns, utterly outclassed Type 95s in every measurable specification. But the landing became a disaster. Landing craft mechanized carrying Shermans deposited their charges on reefs hundreds of yards offshore. Inadequate waterproofing caused engines to flood and stall. Of the initial waves, only 2 Shermans reached shore intact. One of those tanks, China Gal, duelled with a Type 95 light tank in direct combat. The Japanese 37mm gun struck China Gal's turret, jamming the turret ring and disabling the main gun. Unable to return fire, China Gal's crew drove directly at the Hargo and rammed it, destroying the lighter Japanese tank through sheer mass. This encounter, while dramatic, suggested that Japanese tanks posed legitimate threats even to superior American armour. But as the battle progressed and more Marines landed, a different reality emerged. Marine riflemen, pinned down on the beach under withering fire from concrete bunkers and machine gun positions, began engaging the dug-in Type 95s with whatever weapons they could bring to bear. M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, and even M1 carbines all found targets on the Japanese tanks. Staff Sergeant Norman Hatch, a Marine Corps combat photographer documenting the assault, recorded footage showing Marines firing directly at Japanese armour positions. The footage captured something remarkable. Rounds that struck Japanese tank hulls frequently penetrated, sending sparks and fragments ricocheting inside the crew compartments. Tanks that intelligence had warned could anchor defensive positions and dominate killing zones were being suppressed by rifle fire. Technical Sergeant Jim Crow, commanding a platoon pinned down near a wrecked LVT, later reported that his Marines discovered they could disable Japanese tanks by concentrating fire on specific vulnerable points. The turret, ring, where 12mm armour met 9mm top plate, proved particularly susceptible. The engine deck, protected by only 9mm, could be penetrated by sustained automatic weapons fire. Vision blocks shattered under impact, blinding crews. Most significantly, armour-piercing .30-06 rounds fired from M1, Garands at ranges under 50 metres, punched completely through Type 95 hull sides. Marines reported seeing entry holes on one side and exit holes on the opposite hull plate. The shaped charge warheads of Japanese 37mm rounds could penetrate Sherman armour. American rifle bullets could penetrate Hargo armour. The asymmetry was complete. The 7 Type 95 tanks at Tarawa were all destroyed during the 76-hour battle. Some fell to Sherman fire. Others succumbed to flamethrowers, satchel charges, or artillery. Several were disabled by coordinated rifle fire that killed crews without destroying the vehicles. Post-battle examination revealed extensive battle damage from small arms, including multiple penetrations from standard infantry weapons. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Marine Corps intelligence officers examining the destroyed tanks drafted detailed reports documenting the armor penetration patterns. Ordnance specialists compared damage to known ballistic characteristics of various American weapons. The conclusion was inescapable and profound. The Type 95 Hago could be defeated by weapons every Marine infantryman carried as standard equipment. This realization fundamentally altered tactical doctrine. Previous guidance had instructed infantry to take cover when encountering enemy armor and call for specialized anti-tank support. New directives emphasized that Japanese light tanks represented vulnerable targets that infantry could engage directly using organic weapons. The psychological impact on Marine morale was immense. They didn't need to fear Japanese armor, they needed to shoot it. The technical explanation for this vulnerability lay in basic materials science. The Type 95's armor consisted of rolled homogeneous steel plates 12 mm thick at maximum. This thickness provided adequate protection against rifle-caliber rounds at long range, where bullet velocity decreased and impact energy dissipated. But at close range, particularly under 100 meters, high-velocity 30-06 armor-piercing rounds retained sufficient energy to defeat 12 mm steel. The M2 armor-piercing rounds hardened steel core, traveling at velocities exceeding 2,500 feet per second at close range, concentrated impact force on a small area. When the bullet struck armor, the steel core penetrated while the surrounding lead and copper jacket fragmented. The core continued through the armor plate, emerging inside the crew compartment where it ricocheted at high velocity, creating a lethal environment for tank crews. Comparative testing conducted after Tarawa demonstrated the extent of Japanese vulnerability. A captured Type 95 subjected to systematic weapons testing showed that M1 Garand rifles firing M2 armor-piercing ammunition penetrated hull-side armor at ranges up to 75 meters, with consistent penetration at 50 meters. Browning automatic rifles firing the same ammunition achieved penetration at similar ranges with higher probability due to sustained automatic fire. .50 caliber machine guns, mounted on vehicles or in defensive positions, penetrated Type 95 armor at ranges exceeding 200 meters, defeating all hull surfaces except the mantlet. The 37mm guns on M3 Stuart tanks and M3 half-tracks completely dominated Japanese armor, achieving penetration at ranges exceeding 500 meters. 75mm armor-piercing shells from Sherman tanks punched clean through Type 95s, with documented cases of rounds entering one side and exiting the opposite hull plate without significant deceleration. These results stood in stark contrast to Japanese anti-tank capabilities against American armor. The Type 95's 37mm gun could not penetrate Sherman frontal armor at any range. Side armor was vulnerable only at close range with optimal impact angles. Japanese tank crews faced opponents they could barely damage while being destroyed by weapons as simple as infantry rifles. June 16, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. Japanese commanders, recognizing that static defense would fail against American firepower superiority, ordered the largest Japanese armor attack of the Pacific War. 44 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks and Type 95 light tanks from the 9th Tank Regiment stormed the Marine beachhead at dawn. The attack represented Japan's most concentrated armored effort, combining their best available tanks with infantry support in a coordinated assault designed to drive American forces back into the sea. Type 97 Chiha medium tanks weighing 15 tons and featuring 25mm frontal armor with 47mm main guns, represented Japan's most capable armor. Type 95s provided speed and maneuverability in support roles. The attack lasted only hours. Marine Shermans, positioned in hull-down defensive positions, engaged at maximum range. 37mm anti-tank guns and 75mm guns mounted on M3 half-tracks opened fire. Bazookas launched rockets at close-range targets, and Marine riflemen, now thoroughly trained in anti-tank tactics, concentrated fire on vulnerable points. The massacre was complete. 33 Japanese tanks were destroyed in the opening engagement. The remaining 11 were hunted down and eliminated over the following hours. The 9th Tank Regiment effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. Post-battle assessment revealed that many Type 95s showed extensive damage from small arms fire, with crews killed or incapacitated by rifle bullets penetrating hull armor. Sergeant Robert Graf, whose platoon destroyed 3 Hargos using only infantry weapons, later described the engagement. His Marines had established a defensive line across the anticipated attack axis. When Japanese tanks appeared, moving at high speed across open ground, every rifle and automatic weapon opened fire. The concentrated firepower shattered vision blocks, penetrated engine decks, and riddled crew compartments with armor-piercing rounds. One Type 95, struck repeatedly by bar fire aimed at the hull side, veered off course and crashed into a shell crater. When Marines approached cautiously, they found the crew dead from wounds inflicted by bullets that had penetrated 12mm armor. The tank itself remained mechanically functional, its engine still running, but the crew compartment resembled a slaughterhouse, where high-velocity projectiles had ricocheted internally. The technical reports from Saipan confirmed what Tarawa had suggested. Japanese light armor could not survive in environments where American infantry possessed clear fields of fire and sufficient ammunition. The Type 95's mobility, which had proven so valuable in China and Malaya, became irrelevant when every Marine position could engage with armor-defeating weapons. But Malaya also revealed the Hargo's mechanical limitations. Although the diesel engines proved reliable in tropical heat, the narrow tracks and high ground pressure meant tanks frequently bogged down in soft terrain. The bell-crank suspension system, while simple and easy to maintain, produced severe pitching over rough ground that made accurate gunnery nearly impossible at speed. Crews reported that rapid cross-country movement left them unable to acquire and engage targets effectively. By mid-1942, Type 95 tanks had participated in Japanese victories across thousands of miles of territory. They had supported landings in the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. Intelligence officers in Washington and Melbourne compiled reports on Japanese armor capabilities based on these early encounters. The reports documented the Hargo's specifications, noting its thin armor but emphasizing its mobility and the skill of Japanese tank crews. What these intelligence summaries failed to capture was the fundamental mismatch between Japanese armored doctrine and Pacific warfare reality. The Type 95 had been designed for operations in Manchuria and China, where long sight lines, open terrain, and poorly equipped opponents made speed and maneuverability more valuable than armor protection. Pacific Islands offered dense jungle, volcanic rock, coral atolls, and engagement ranges, measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds. American Marines preparing for counteroffensive operations in the South Pacific studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. They knew Japanese forces possessed tanks. They knew those tanks had proven effective in multiple campaigns. What they didn't yet understand was that the same armor specifications that had seemed adequate against Chinese infantry in 1937 would prove catastrophically insufficient against American weapons in 1942. July 1944. Marine Corps Schools, Quantico, Virginia. Instructors revised tactical doctrine based on lessons learned from Tarawa and Saipan. The new training manuals included detailed sections on engaging Japanese armor with organic infantry weapons. Diagrams illustrated optimal aim points on Type 95 tanks, Tables listed effective engagement ranges for various weapons against different armor thicknesses. The message was explicit and revolutionary. Japanese tanks were not threats requiring specialized response. They were targets. This represented a complete inversion of traditional anti-tank doctrine. For decades, military theorists had emphasized that infantry caught in the open by enemy armor faced catastrophic disadvantage. Tanks were designed specifically to be invulnerable to rifle fire. The psychological impact of armored vehicles derived partly from this invulnerability, from the knowledge that ordinary soldiers could not harm the steel monsters bearing down on them. But the Type 95 shattered this paradigm. A Marine rifleman with an M1 Garand and armor-piercing ammunition could destroy a Japanese tank at 50 meters. A BAR gunner with a good firing position could disable multiple tanks. A machine gun crew with a .50 caliber weapon could engage armor at ranges where tank crews couldn't effectively return fire. The balance of power had inverted completely. The psychological transformation this created among Marine infantry cannot be overstated. Men who might have broken and run when facing armor instead maintained positions and engaged directly. Squad leaders who might have called for tank support instead organized concentrated fire with organic weapons. The confidence that came from knowing Japanese armor was vulnerable translated into aggressive tactics that accelerated American advances across the Pacific. Japanese commanders recognized the disaster unfolding. After-action reports from surviving tank officers documented the Type 95's inadequacy against American forces. One report from Saipan, recovered from Japanese documents after the battle, noted that tank crews felt they were driving coffins rather than combat vehicles. The thin armor that had seemed adequate in 1935 offered no protection against American weapons in 1944. The Imperial Japanese Army General Staff had actually recognized this vulnerability earlier. In the Prosekit, late 1930s, analyzing combat results from Khalkhin Gol, they determined that the Type 95 was vulnerable to heavy machine gun fire, specifically .5 to 0-inch caliber weapons. Requirements were issued for a new light tank with the same weight as the Type 95, but with thicker armor. The resulting development programs produced prototypes, but never achieved mass production. Japan entered the Pacific War with armor designed for conflicts that ended years earlier, September 15, 1944. Peleliu, Palau Islands. The 1st Marine Division encountered 15 Type 95s, positioned in defensive revetments and caves. Japanese commanders had learned that aggressive tank attacks resulted in rapid destruction. The new doctrine emphasized using tanks as mobile pillboxes, firing from concealed positions, and withdrawing before American forces could coordinate effective response. This tactic prolonged tank survival, but surrendered the mobility that represented the Type 95's primary advantage. Dug into fixed positions, Hargos became merely lightly armored bunkers with 37mm guns, and unlike concrete fortifications that could withstand multiple artillery strikes, the thin-skinned tanks succumbed quickly to concentrated fire. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, whose memoir With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa became one of the Pacific War's most famous accounts, described encountering a Type 95 positioned in a coral cave. His unit engaged with rifle fire, rounds sparking off the hull and turret. Within minutes, the crew attempted to evacuate. Some were shot as they emerged. Others died when Marines threw grenades into the open hatches. Sledge noted the pathetic nature of Japanese armor in his memoir. The tanks that intelligence briefings had described as dangerous opponents proved to be vulnerable targets that Marines engaged almost casually. The psychological threat of armor, the fear that tanks inspired in infantry, simply didn't apply to Type 95s. They were obstacles to be eliminated, not threats to be feared. The final major engagement between Marine infantry and Type 95 tanks occurred at Iwo Jima in February 1945. Japanese forces on the island possessed limited armor, and most Type 95s were dug into fixed positions as gun emplacements rather than operating as mobile weapons. Marines encountering these positions eliminated them with combinations of flamethrowers, satchel charges, and concentrated rifle fire. One engagement, documented by 5th Marine Division after-action reports, illustrated how completely doctrine had changed. A platoon advancing across the island's volcanic ash encountered 2 Type 95s positioned hull-down behind ridges. Rather than requesting tank or artillery support, the platoon sergeant directed his BAR gunners to engage while riflemen maneuvered for better firing positions. Within 10 minutes, both Japanese tanks were disabled, one with its engine compartment on fire, the other with its crew killed by armor-piercing rounds that penetrated the hull. The ease with which Marines eliminated Japanese armor at Iwo Jima stood in stark contrast to the desperate fighting required to reduce concrete bunkers and cave positions. Fortifications constructed from reinforced concrete, buried under volcanic rock, could withstand direct hits from 14-inch naval shells. Type 95s, buried in similar positions, fell to rifle fire. The investment in armor production, the training of tank crews, the logistical effort to transport tanks to remote islands, all proved largely wasted because the fundamental design was obsolete. By 1945, captured intelligence documents revealed that Japan had developed newer tank designs with substantially improved armor protection. The Type 3 Chinu medium tank featured 50mm frontal armor and mounted a 75mm gun capable of threatening American Shermans. The Type 4 Chi-2 medium tank featured maximum armor thickness of 75mm. These designs, developed specifically to counter American armor superiority, never reached Pacific battlefields in significant numbers. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained by strategic bombing and naval blockade, could not produce sufficient numbers of modern tanks while simultaneously manufacturing aircraft, ships, and other war materials. The decision to prioritize other weapon systems over armor modernization reflected Japan's strategic situation. Naval and air forces could potentially influence the war's outcome. Tank forces, restricted to defensive operations on isolated islands, could at best delay American advances by days or weeks. The Type 95 remained in production through 1943, with over 2,300 completed before manufacturing ceased. These tanks were distributed across the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, from Saipan to Okinawa. Almost all were destroyed in combat or abandoned when positions became untenable. Very few Type 95s survived the war intact. The final combat use of Type 95s in the Pacific occurred during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945. Soviet forces, equipped with 34 medium tanks featuring 45mm frontal armor and 85mm guns, encountered Japanese armor in several engagements. The results were predictable. Soviet tanks destroyed Type 95s at long range with near impunity. The thin armor that couldn't stop American 30-06 rifles certainly couldn't stop Soviet 85mm armor-piercing shells. Japanese tank crews at the Battle of Shumshu attempted a desperate counterattack against Soviet beachhead positions. Type 95s charged across open ground toward Soviet anti-tank guns. The attack failed catastrophically, with Japanese armor destroyed before closing to effective range. Soviet after-action reports noted with surprise how easily Japanese tanks were eliminated, contrasting them with German armor Soviet forces had fought in Europe. Post-war analysis by American ordnance experts examined the Type 95 in detail, comparing it to contemporary designs from all major combatants. The conclusions documented systematic Japanese failure to develop armor adequate for modern warfare. The 12mm maximum thickness that seemed reasonable in 1935 was completely insufficient by 1942. Yet Japan continued producing the same basic design with only minor modifications for 7 years. The comparison with German armor development illustrated the magnitude of Japanese failure. Germany's Panzer III, entering service in 1939 with 30mm of frontal armor, underwent continuous upgrades, reaching 50mm by 1942 and 70mm in final variants. The Panzer IV, initially featuring similar armor to early Panzer IIIs, eventually mounted 80mm of frontal protection. German armor evolved to meet increasing threats. Japanese armor stagnated. The Type 95 that rolled off production lines in 1943 featured essentially identical armor to units produced in 1936. Minor improvements included upgraded optics and modified ammunition storage, but the fundamental protection remained unchanged. Japan entered the Pacific War with obsolete armor and never corrected the deficiency. The human cost of this failure fell on Japanese tank crews, who knew they operated death traps. Accounts from prisoners captured after Saipan revealed that tank crews understood perfectly well that their armor offered minimal protection. They recognized that American weapons could penetrate their vehicles easily, yet military discipline and cultural expectations of self-sacrifice meant crews continued, operating tanks they knew were obsolete, fighting battles they understood were hopeless. One captured tank commander, interviewed after Guam, described the psychological burden of commanding a Type 95 against Marines. He knew that engaging American forces meant near certain death. Sherman tanks could destroy his vehicle at ranges where his 37mm gun could barely scratch their armor. American infantry could penetrate his hull with standard rifles. Even successful ambushes, achieved through perfect positioning and surprise, typically resulted in his tank being destroyed by return fire within minutes. The commander's testimony revealed the desperation of Japanese armor tactics in the war's final year. Commanders planned operations knowing they would not survive. Tank crews said goodbye to friends before missions, understanding they were effectively conducting suicide attacks. The tanks themselves, which should have provided psychological comfort through their armor protection, instead served as mobile coffins that happened to carry guns. This contrasted starkly with American tank crews' experience. Sherman tank commanders, while acknowledging their vehicles' vulnerabilities to German 88mm guns in Europe, still possessed significant protection against most threats. In the Pacific, Shermans dominated completely. Marine tank crews operated with confidence that Japanese weapons could rarely penetrate their armor, that most engagements would result in enemy destruction rather than their own. The approximately 15 Type 95s, preserved in museums worldwide, stand as physical evidence of Japanese armoured warfare failure. The Australian War Memorial's example, recovered from Milne Bay, shows clear penetration damage from small arms fire. Multiple bullet holes mark the hull and turret, documentation of the fatal flaw that made Japanese light armour vulnerable to infantry weapons. Museum visitors examining these tanks often express surprise at how thin the armour appears. 12mm translates to less than half an inch. The armour plates that were supposed to protect three-man crews from enemy fire barely exceed the thickness of heavy cardboard. Running one's hand across the hull plates, one can feel the thinness, understand the inadequacy, recognize why Marines could defeat these vehicles with standard rifles. The technical specifications that seemed adequate during peacetime design reviews proved catastrophically insufficient in combat. The calculations that showed 12mm would stop 7.7mm armor-piercing rounds at moderate ranges failed to account for close-range combat with more powerful ammunition. The decision to prioritize mobility over protection, which made sense for operations in China, proved fatal against American forces in the Pacific. Military historians studying the Pacific War identify the Type 95 as a case study in failed armored doctrine. The tank represented 1930s thinking applied to 1940s warfare. It embodied assumptions about combat that events quickly proved false, and Japan's industrial and bureaucratic systems proved incapable of correcting the mistake quickly enough to matter. The broader lesson extends beyond armor specifications to encompass military adaptation under pressure. Germany, facing 34 tanks that outclassed existing panzers, developed the Panther and Tiger within 2 years. The Soviet Union, recognizing German armor superiority in 1941, produced upgraded 34 variants and heavy tank designs. America, discovering that Sherman armor was vulnerable to German anti-tank guns, developed heavier tanks and modified existing vehicles with additional protection. Japan, recognizing that Type 95 armor was inadequate, designed better tanks but never produced them in meaningful numbers. The institutional inertia, industrial limitations, and strategic miscalculations that prevented armor modernization reflected larger problems that contributed to Japan's defeat. The inability to adapt weapon systems to changing battlefield realities represented a failure that extended across multiple domains. For American Marines who fought across the Pacific, the Type 95's vulnerability provided rare advantage in otherwise desperate combat. Island assaults against entrenched defenders typically resulted in horrific casualties. Any factor that reduced Japanese defensive capability saved American lives. The discovery that standard rifles could defeat Japanese tanks meant Marines possessed one more tool for suppressing enemy positions, one more way to survive battles where life expectancy measured in hours. The statistical impact of this advantage is difficult to quantify precisely. How many Marine lives were saved because they could suppress Japanese tanks with rifle fire, rather than requiring specialized anti-tank weapons? How many successful advances occurred because Marines confidently engaged armor instead of taking cover and waiting for support? The numbers cannot be calculated, but the qualitative impact was real. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The story of Marines discovering that 30 caliber rounds penetrated all sides of the Japanese Type 95 tank ultimately reveals the deadly consequences of designing weapon systems for previous wars rather than future conflicts. Japan entered the Pacific War with armor adequate for conflicts in China during the 1930s. They faced opponents equipped with weapons designed for modern industrial warfare. The mismatch was complete, and the results were predictable. The Type 95 Hargo stands as monument to military miscalculation, to the fatal gap between peacetime assumptions and wartime reality. Its thin armor, which Japanese engineers calculated would provide adequate protection, instead created mobile targets that American infantrymen could destroy with standard equipment. The psychological advantage armor should have provided Japanese forces instead transferred to their opponents, who learned they need not fear machines they could defeat with rifles. In the end, the discovery that occurred at Milne Bay in August 1942, confirmed at Tarawa in November 1943, and exploited across dozens of Pacific islands until August 1945, demonstrated a simple but profound truth. Armor thickness matters more than doctrine assumes. Protection specifications that seem adequate on paper prove insufficient when tested by modern weapons at close range. And the side that recognizes these realities first, adapts fastest, and exploits advantages most effectively, survives. The Marines who found Japanese Type 95s and realized their 30 caliber rounds penetrated all sides didn't just discover a tactical advantage. They revealed the complete obsolescence of Japanese armor doctrine and the fundamental failure of Japan's military-industrial system to produce weapons adequate for the war they were actually fighting. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.